you can put in it, and even how to get going. And if you're not sure, you're not alone. Many people don't realize whether they have a copyright policy or not. And the first thing I always tell them after a session is to go back and see what documents are available. You may have an older copyright compliance policy. You may have a legal opinion. You may have bits and pieces, maybe some guidelines on interpreting fair use or fair dealing. So go to those pieces as you're starting, as your start. Next. So let's go through what I think are 7 essential tips, whether you're writing your first policy, revising your current policy, or even determining whether your current policy really works for you. So the first point is, before you write anything or rewrite anything, spend some time on defining and refining your policy's purpose. This is a good time to get out to the different departments and individuals in your organization to talk to them, see what the issues are, the copyright issues, perhaps the licensing issues, and see where they're lacking information they need and practical advice so they can get their work done and legally use third-party content. Next, speak to your audience. Who is it who's going to use this copyright policy? If you're just creating a document, it's going to get signed and thrown in a drawer or on a website or intranet. That's of no help to you. So think about who your audience is and how they're going to use the policy. So is your audience a young group who are very technology savvy and respond better to certain language, or are they older, or a mix? Are you speaking to a librarian or a social media manager? They may come to the table with very different ideas, and you may need to speak to them in different voices. Perhaps they're an educator or graphic designer. As you probably know, copyright affects everyone. So you have to determine in your policy, and you may even think about having more than one policy or sections for different audiences. How are you going to speak to them? Plain English is essential because this is not a legal document. Be practical, have FAQs. And I always say less information is actually better. Don't inundate someone with a 25-page policy because they'll never get past the first page. Some people actually have 1-page copyright compliance policies. Some have 5 or 10 pages. But for me, I think the shorter, the more effective. Next. Know what uses of copyright materials are taking place in your organization, because those are the uses you want to address. You don't want to give some esoteric examples. You want to see who's using what. Is your audience using images they find through Google searches? Do they understand what the copyright implications are of that? Perhaps they're teaching online courses, or perhaps they spend half their day posting on social media on behalf of your organization. Are they using content you own, or is that third-party content? And do they have permission? So your policy really needs to be specific and tailored to those uses of copyright materials. What about future uses and technology? You'll address them later. Later on, you'll see that your policy is not a static document. Another area you may want to look into, again, depending on your particular audience and uses, are Creative Commons licenses. Whether you're using them on content you create or whether you're using content that is covered by a Creative Commons license, because CC licenses are commonly misunderstood. Next. It's really important that your policy reflects the reality of the content we use and share and publish. And that means global or international. You can't just think domestic. So if you're based in the US, of course, it's very important that your policy reflects US copyright, but you also have to think about other countries and where you're getting that content from. So if you're grabbing an image from a website in Australia, your policy needs to address what the copyright implications are for that. Or if you're licensing an electronic database from the UK, then your policy needs to reflect what laws govern that relationship. Next, you want to address some misinformation that we all hear and see, and you'll probably identify in your initial consultations when you're trying to define the purpose of your policy. One of those is unlocatable copyright owners, which are often also called orphan works. If you try and locate a copyright owner in the US, you may spend 1 hour or 25 hours, but you're not able to either identify or locate that copyright owner. There's nothing in the US copyright law that allows you to use that work. So that's a sort of situation which many people don't understand, and that can lead to an interesting discussion about risk management and the fact that sometimes people do use content even though it's not specifically allowed under the law, but they've made some sort of analysis and looked at the risk and determined whether that use is permitted in their organization or not. And that also relates to having some sort of copyright person, not necessarily a lawyer, but someone who's very familiar with copyright, works with copyright issues and materials all the time, who can help determine risk management in each situation so that each situation is analyzed on its own. Next. Your policy is really only as helpful and good as you use it to educate others. So you really have to keep in mind throughout the process what you're going to do with that policy once it's approved and in writing and ready to get out there. How are you going to share it? In print, online, through a webinar like this, through in-person sessions. And as you can see, the title of this slide, Share, Educate, Repeat, it's an ongoing process where you continuously have to get the message out. So think about through your process, and even from the beginning of your initial consultations, you're actually starting to educate others by telling them what you're doing, what you're looking for, examining the issues, making a list perhaps of their questions. So you really want to address and consult with everyone who will listen initially, and then once you have a document, to use it as an educational piece and to get back out there with information and answers and practical ways to deal with copyright materials. So you want to educate new employees, interns, consultants, students, faculty, marketing department, senior management, really everyone who will listen. And sometimes when I say everyone who will listen, it may mean free pizza, it may mean a Starbucks $5 gift card, whatever you can do to get people in the door that will make your policy useful. Next. So our 7th point, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, is that this is a live document. Things change, people change, technology changes, new court cases, sometimes new laws. So you want to continuously be reviewing your policy. I don't mean every day, but have some sort of procedure in place right in your policy. Let's say once a year, unless of course something hits your radar that there's been a big court case that might affect the way you use content. But put something right in the document so you're always examining it, and it's just part of a regular schedule. Probably 1 year is sufficient. Next. So those are the 7 points I want to get across today. And as you're thinking about some questions you may have, I want to share with you some sample wording to state your purpose. Because as I said at the beginning of today's session, I think taking that extra time and really having a purpose that guides you into the content that goes into your policy is really essential for having an effective policy. So let me read some sample wording that I've used in policies that I've created. The first one, the purpose of this policy is to provide a summary of U.S. copyright law, particularly as it relates to electronic courses. This policy is necessary because copyright laws are not always straightforward and because the application of copyright laws can be frustrating. So you can see the purpose of that one is just for e-courses or online courses. Another one, the purpose of this policy is to provide the board and employees of XYZ Library with a summary of Canadian copyright law as it relates to internal and patron copying of non-digital and digital materials. So again, a very specific purpose, but they don't always have to be that specific. Let me give you another example. The purpose of these copyright guidelines is to provide general information on how global copyright law works, notice global, and to provide answers through FAQs to simpler scenarios to those, I can't read there, to those employees to have a consistent approach to deal with copyright issues. So again, another way of looking at it. And then one which I find is extremely important in across really all organizations. And again, this is somewhat specific. The purpose of these copyright guidelines is to ensure that all employees of Company Y have a minimum knowledge of copyright law and that they can follow the procedures in these guidelines when using third-party content. Third-party content is copyright materials not owned by Company Y. So those are a few fairly succinct purposes for copyright policy, and hopefully to help you focus on how you would like your policy to be used and what issues to address in that policy. Any questions? I can always keep talking, but if there's some questions, I can't see them. So
no worries. Thank you, Leslie. I've got some here. So that's some useful points there, some really quite practical and helpful advice there. So thanks for that so far. We do have a couple of questions that have come through, and I would encourage anybody that's got one in their mind to go ahead and type into the chat box right now. But while you do that, let me just ask you the first one that came through. So someone's asked, when should we consider implementing a copyright policy? Is there a a better time than others, or is immediately the answer? What's your view on that one?
That's a great question, especially since a majority of the people on this call do not have one. It really could be many factors. There could be a recent lawsuit that scares you or that may affect you, and you think, oh, well, we better have a policy in place. You may actually, hopefully not be sued, but you may have possibly infringed copyright, and you negotiated a settlement, and that's often when organizations do implement copyright policies. There's really so many reasons. Maybe you signed a new license agreement for a large electronic database and you want to make sure the content is being legally used. You may have employees who are really frustrated trying to comply with the law when your organization is saying you better comply, but they have no tools to comply with the law. Could be, as I said, a change in the law or new technology. But one thing I think is really important is to be proactive and not to wait until you're sued or until a copyright owner approaches you, but to start thinking about it now, or see if you have any documents in writing, because it can take some time depending on how your approval process works. And of course, you want to consult with everyone and do your research. So they're not just implemented overnight, but I think the most important part is to be proactive. Don't wait until you have a problem. Start thinking about how a copyright policy would help you now.
Right, and I mean that's good actually, because that actually leads right into the next question in relation to the writing and the creation of the policy. So somebody has asked, typically, how long might they expect it to take, rather, to write a copyright policy? How long would it take?
Another very good question, and that it can depend on so many factors. Are you trying to write, let's say, a one-page policy with the purpose statement and maybe 10 FAQs, or are you trying to write a comprehensive 10-page one? So it really depends on what you're trying to do, and what really the content you're trying to cover. So it could take a few days, it could take several months, it could take many drafts, it could take a long time to get approval by senior management. Some people actually create policies but call them copyright guidelines, and that's the way to get them out more quickly without having to get different signatures and approvals. So again, I would say start sooner rather than later. And you can also start small. Start with a one-page document or two-page document, and then see how effective that is. And maybe that will bring up other copyright and licensing issues, and then expand on that. Because as I said, it is a live document. And once you get copyright information out there, people will have a lot of questions, and they'll come out of the woodwork, and they will definitely help you figure out the content for expanding that policy.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And one more question just coming through now. How often should the policy be updated? You may have touched on this earlier, but I guess if you're just starting one from fresh and from scratch, should it be revisited more often in the first 6 months, or would you just recommend an annual review? What's your thoughts?
I guess it partly depends on how long it takes you to develop and write that policy. So if it's a two-pager that you created, in 4 weeks, then it's not as huge a burden to review it in 6 months. But generally, I say a year, because if you think about it, even reviewing it once a year, if you're making changes to it, it will take time to implement those changes. So really the difference between the final date on each update of a policy will be longer than a year. And of course, if there is new legislation or an important court case, that's a good time. If you can't amend it, at least to put out information about that new development, and then of course incorporate it in your next draft.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. And we have another one coming through now. Is it a good idea to include that in your policy, the organization has a license with Copyright Clearance Center?
I think so. And when I've helped people create policies, I recommend they include any CCC license and any licenses with vendors or electronic databases, because at the end of the day, I think it's really nice to have a document that not only educates, but says, hey, we've already paid for the permissions for uses of this content, contact X, and you can use this information. And if your document is online, of course, you can have links. So you can keep the main body of your copyright policy short, and then link, let's say, to your CCC license, the terms and conditions, or at least a summary of them, and then link to a list of all your vendor licenses.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Well, I think that's it. So if anyone else has a question, then please go ahead now or forever hold your peace. But, I think we're all done on the questions, so thanks ever so much for addressing those. Certainly very useful advice there. The promotional discount that we promised to make available is simply Sutron there. So Leslie, perhaps you just want to tell the audience how they might apply that and where they should do that, if that's okay.
Sorry, how they access the course?
Exactly,
Oh,
yes.
Here. I think that's a link. If you can't find it, if you go to copyrightlaws.com, you'll find it on our homepage. Mm-hmm. And perhaps, Tony, we can send an email out to everyone who attended today.
Sure.
With that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
We can certainly distribute that. There's no problem there.
Okay, super. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope if you're interested in joining us in drafting your policy, this is a unique online course where through a series of very short assignments, you end up creating a draft policy in a group atmosphere. And many of our students have then gone on to finalize and implement their policies. So let's call it a jumpstart course. Great. Well, thank you, Tony, and everyone for attending today.
Oh, sure, no problem. Thanks. It just remains really for me to just thank Leslie for sharing her insight and her expertise with us there. Certainly very interesting, very, very current and very valid content really to help people. We trust it was helpful to you and it will continue to be helpful in your day-to-day. Please keep an eye for any further sessions, and we will conduct further ones as per interest levels dictate, and we will also make sure to distribute the content on the discount code for you also as promised after this session. But thanks ever so much for your attention. We do appreciate that everybody's busy, and we are grateful for your attention today. Thanks once more to Leslie, and we will wish you all a very good day. Thank you ever so much for joining us. We do appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you, Leslie. Bye-bye.
Bye.